Attention Institute personnel, just a quick announcement to let you know that this episode, investigating the Federation of the Americas, is brought to you by the still untitled Templin Institute podcast currently in the works. As a kind of companion piece to this investigation, we've released a very rough pilot for the Templin Institute podcast over on the Templin Archives. You'll find a link in the description. As to what the podcast is actually about, well, you might remember that a few years ago now, we released an episode on the settlement defense front from Call of Duty Infinite Warfare, and then a couple days later, I followed up with that with my own personal thoughts on why the faction worked or didn't work. And this podcast is the same idea. If you'd like to hear my opinion on what the Federation of the Americas does well and what they kind of screwed up on, head over to the Templin Archives. Thanks everyone, and be sure to let me know what you think of this podcast and anything else over there. Thanks again.
Throughout the early decades of the 21st century, the return of the multipolar world seemed inevitable. The United States would no longer be a single hyperpower, but one among several. Potential rival superpowers included the People's Republic of China, the European Union, India, and a resurgent Russia. The Tel Aviv War and the global energy crisis it triggered, however, crippled these countries along with the United States. With the international power structure undergoing its greatest change since the fall of the Soviet Union, the path to global superpower status was open to seemingly unlikely possibilities. With this new era dawning, on June 2nd, 2014, Brazil, Argentina, and Chile united to form a new nation. In an instant, a new superpower was born: the Federation of the Americas. The unlikely success of unification sentiments across South America was born, somewhat paradoxically, out of right-wing populism and jingoistic nationalism. The Tel Aviv War was seen as the latest example in a long history of American and Eurocentric arrogance, which came at the expense of historically marginalized and exploited Third World nations. The Federation was the natural expansion of this sentiment, a purposeful attempt to create a new counterweight in global affairs. Echoing the Pan-American rhetoric of Simón Bolívar, the Federation pursued a foreign policy of aggressive expansion. Through both skillful diplomacy, the threat and use of economic and military force, and the simple idealistic belief in a united South America, the Federation eventually came to encompass the entire continent. The legitimacy of this consolidation varied from nation to nation. While every former nation within the Federation is granted the status of member state, many are seen internationally as occupied territories. The prominence of authoritarian governments and policies across its founding nations continued into the Federation itself. It is a totalitarian dictatorship with many fascist aspects, including the forced suppression of political opposition and ultra-nationalist rhetoric based on the idea of national rebirth. The social indoctrination of its citizens is widespread, achieved through state education, propaganda, and media. This propaganda harnesses the diverse, vibrant culture of Latin America, injecting them with a sense of supremacism, exceptionalism, and victim mentality. The amity between South American cultures is a constant of state media, with even the positive relations with native tribes particularly prized by the government. This sense of moral superiority is in turn directed against the United States, Europe, and Asia, characterized as the traditional parasites of freedom and economic prosperity, both within the Federation and across the world. While this is undoubtedly exaggerated for political purposes, the decline of the United States and the traditional great powers was of enormous benefit to the Federation's economy. The global energy crisis transformed Venezuela from an impoverished, failed state to energy superpower virtually overnight. Brazil, meanwhile, as the largest economy within South America, was well placed to invest in its neighbors and capitalize on shifting global trends. With the establishment of a single global economy and the expansion of the Federation, the nation's economic potential skyrocketed. By 2027, the Federation of the Americas had emerged from years of rapid growth to become the largest economy on the planet. Much of this new wealth was directed towards military spending. The Federation Army, Navy, and Air Force, the three primary branches of the nation, had imported much of their hardware from overseas. Russian equipment is the most common, with AK-12 assault rifles, T-90 MS main battle tanks, and Mi-28 Havoc attack helicopters ubiquitous across its ground divisions. These have been both imported directly and produced locally under license. The Air Force likewise operates MiG-29 fighter aircraft. However, Western equipment is also found across its branches, with F-15 fighter aircraft and Arleigh Burke-class destroyers in its air and naval forces. The irregularity between its military equipment and the problems this poses in terms of training and maintenance is offset by the cheap cost at which these items can be obtained. Even so, their use is purely as a stopgap measure until indigenous production can meet the demands of the Federation military. Early efforts by South American defense contractors, namely Industrias Soberanas, have resulted in the X-08 Selva Tiger main battle tank and the Aegis-class destroyer, a modification of the Arleigh Burke class intended to incorporate designs reverse-engineered from American littoral combat ships. The sophistication and potential of South American military forces moved from theory to practice with the outbreak of war between the Federation and the United States. This open conflict materialized out of years of growing tensions between the two powers, which reached their breaking point in the attempted invasion of Caracas by the United States in 2015. While the invasion ended in a tentative armistice, it energized the Federation's population with anti-American sentiments. In 2017, the truce was broken when the United States' own Orbital Defense Initiative was hijacked by Federation agents. A series of kinetic weapons were launched at American cities, turning parts of Southern California, Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, Nevada, Louisiana, and Florida into a devastated no-man's land. This preemptive strike resulted in the deaths of 27 million Americans and was quickly followed by an enormous land invasion through Mexico. The initial surprise and success of this attack was eventually frustrated by American counterattacks, turning what was to be a swift campaign into a stalemate, but one fought on American soil. Incursions into Federation territory, most notably by an unknown amalgamation of American Special Forces units, successfully prevented the salvaged remains of Odin from being restored. But the stalemate remains. The Federation has been denied its critical strike, and the United States granted the time it needs to rebuild and rearm. But above all, the Federation has displayed the uncanny ability to mobilize its population around seemingly impossible goals, and turn the weapons of their enemies against them.
The Templin Institute investigates the nations, factions, and organizations of alternate worlds. If you've enjoyed this video and would like to join the Templin Institute, consider pledging to our Patreon page. Along with increased security access, you'll be able to vote in polls to determine future topics, get custom wallpaper every week, and receive some other exclusive rewards.